right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So today we're doing John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So to give you an idea of the heights from which we have fallen in two elections, 1796 and 1800, we had a choice between the co-founder of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Two of the greatest geniuses who have ever run for the presidency, and that was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Let's see if I can get through this on time today. So starting with John Adams. I read an article once about a list of intelligence factor. Who was the greatest geniuses in the presidency? And my thoughts always go to, well, it must be Thomas Jefferson. And he was certainly the most widely read and had broad knowledge in so many different areas. But they listed John Adams as the one who probably had the highest IQ of any president. Now, but before I get into John Adams, what did I forget from last week? George Washington. It's remarkable looking back on the presidency and how people perceived our government. George Washington, along with most people in government at the time, had a very strict idea of the separation of powers. George Washington felt that the separation between the executive and the legislative branch was not absolute, but very distant. George Washington would never suggest to the Congress any sort of legislation. He did not consider himself a leader of the Congress. And so one thing that he never did was veto any legislation, which in and of itself was not a big deal. There's a number of presidents who never vetoed any legislation. But he felt that it was his duty only in cases of something that was unconstitutional. He felt that if there was a law that Congress passed that he believed went against the Constitution, then he should veto it. And there was one in particular, the bank I mentioned last week, that he thought he was pondering for some time whether that was constitutional or not. But other than that, just because he didn't like any given legislation, it was not for him to veto, because the Congress represented the will of the people. And if the people wanted something, he should not go against it. So that was in the day. It took some time before the presidents started feeling like, yeah, I should be the leader of my party and suggest to them legislation that we should follow, that we should enact. Okay, John Adams. This first one, Francis Russell Adams, An American Dynasty. If you didn't know, and I hate saying this term, the Adams family, but the Adams, the descendants of John Adams, there's a great lineage there. Not just his son, who was also president, but some very prominent names in literature, in the military, and so this book brings that out. I don't know down to today if there's anybody who's really famous who's a descendant of the Adams. John Adams, but truly remarkable family with its share of tragedies as well. But anyway, so that's what this book generally covers. And it's 374 pages, but there's a lot of pictures in it too, so it's not nearly as daunting as even 374 pages. John Quincy Adams and Charles Francis Adams, very scholarly, very intelligent. They wrote extensively. John Adams, 2 volumes, 1871, they published this. Of course, it's posthumously for John Quincy Adams, but as one might expect from an Adams, when they write, John Quincy in particular, it is very dry, it is very scholarly, and not fun reading, but it is very scholarly. David McCullough, I'm sure many of you know this name. Wonderful read, just kind of the polar opposite. If you're reading the style of one person to another, John Quincy Adams versus David McCullough, you'd rather listen to somebody scratch their fingernails across a chalkboard than read John Quincy Adams. But David McCullough, on the other hand, is a great read. How many of you have read this, by the way? Very good, yeah. Wonderful narrative writing, well worth reading. And Page Smith, that I regard very highly because I have a set of his History of the United States. It's 8 pretty thick volumes that are well worth reading. But Page Smith has a 2-volume biography of John Adams that, again, maybe not quite as entertaining as David McCullough, but still a very good read. So I could recommend that too. So I'm going to go through the early years and the early life of John Adams, as well as Thomas Jefferson, very quickly. One thing that I would say about both, actually, the next 3 presidents, all of them, if they were never president, they would still be very famous. As a matter of fact, each of the 3, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, were far more famous for what they did before they were president than for being president. So anyway, born October 30th, 1735, Braintree, Massachusetts, went to Harvard, became a lawyer, married Abigail Smith, 1764, one of the great husband and wife teams in our history, in political history. John Adams and Abigail Adams, as I'll talk a little bit more coming up. They were truly one of the great pairs. They were both highly intelligent, very strong-willed, both of them, which generally you'd think 2 very strong-minded, very intelligent people probably would not get along very well. And they had their issues, but they were usually with other people. For some reason, these 2, who could be very difficult individually, mixed very well together and made an incredible team together. There's Abigail. So I'm skipping through the whole Revolutionary War part, where John Adams really made his name and would be famous today if he were never president. Did a lot for our country during the Revolutionary period. It was called the Atlas of Independence. He pushed for independence in such a way that he convinced the others to ultimately declare independence. But we're moving on. He ultimately became vice president under George Washington, primarily because of his notoriety in the Revolutionary period and his well-known intelligence. He also wrote the constitutions for several of the states, or at least gave a model of constitution for several of the states that were looking to him for guidance. And so he was well known as a great statesman. And of course, he went to France, was a diplomat, was in England as a diplomat. So he was second to Washington in his notoriety. Unfortunately, he was also known as something of a curmudgeon, and sometimes not very easy to get along with. But on a personal level, he could be very engaging, very charming, but politically speaking, he could be very abrasive. So anyway, he presided over the Senate very dutifully. It was not a job, and he found that, as many vice presidents find, that it's a rather thankless job, often seems very insignificant compared to what you are standing next to as far as the presidency. But he did it very dutifully, and he still holds the record. The tiebreaker, that's what the vice president is supposed to do. If there is a tie in the Senate, the only time the vice president can vote is to break the tie. And he did it 31 times. And no other vice president has ever done that. Unfortunately for him, and honestly I don't really know why, but Washington very rarely consulted with John Adams, his vice president. It could be that he had some very good advice already from Hamilton and Jefferson, but still it seems odd to me that with the talent that he had there in John Adams, he did not consider it necessary to consult with him very much. Then the election of 1796. Washington is now retired, and it went to John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. Now there were others in the race too, and the Constitution, as it was originally set up, made it so that the votes, the electoral votes, the one who had the most votes was president. The one who came in second was vice president, because they did not consider the idea that there would be a party system. That was really anathema to them. And for some time, the first several years of our history as a nation, they fought against that. There were the Federalists and there were the Republicans. And Washington never liked that, and most people didn't like that. But Jefferson, Madison, and others set themselves up against the Federalists and became the Republicans. And even they thought, well, you know, it's the other side that's being partisan. Yeah, even today, right? It's always the other side that's partisan. We want what's right for our country. They're being partisan. And they really sincerely believed that back in the day, that all we need to do is convince the other side that they're wrong, and we could be united as a country. So, but everybody knew it was between Adams and Jefferson. Adams came out the winner. Jefferson came in second. So now you have opposing parties, one as president, the other as vice president. Since they had been friends for several years, they tried very hard to work together at first, but they knew it was not going to last. Jefferson as vice president, oddly enough, John Adams sought his advice probably more than Washington sought his as vice president. But their beliefs had separated them to an extent that that they were not going to work together. And Jefferson as vice president, again, not a job that he enjoyed. He considered it, like Adams, an insignificant job that he really didn't want to be at. And anyway, we think of partisan politics now as being a very dirty game, and we see it in the stories that we'll come across where one side is really hitting below the belt. Back in those days, it was far worse. It was a really nasty game that both sides played in the newspapers. Now I want to talk about Abigail as, there was no first lady. It's funny, the term for the wife of the president was presidentess. I think it wasn't until Lincoln was president that they came up with the term first lady, which sounds much nicer. Anyway, when John Adams came to, it was Philadelphia, not Washington, D.C. yet, Abigail had to stay behind at the farm to tend to it. And John Adams very quickly realized that he needed her. They had been separated many different times in his career, and they always pined for each other. And at this point, John Adams is absolutely desperate. Basically, he's telling her in letters as they're exchanging, I don't care about the farm. Let it rot. Give it to somebody, anybody, nobody. I don't care. I want you here, and I will have you. I can't do anything without you. And he said that not just because she was an emotional comfort for him, although she was also his best advisor. More than any in his cabinet, he listened to her advice. She read virtually every newspaper. She knew every congressman, and she could judge. She was a wonderful judge of character. And so when he said, I need you here, he meant it in every sense of that word. One of the things that I was really disappointed about with the two-volume history of John Adams by his son, John Quincy Adams, and grandson, was that they make very little mention of their own grandmother, as someone who is significant in the presidency of John Adams. In my mind, you really cannot leave her out. She, time and time again, gave him the best advice and counsel that he had. And there's Abigail Adams again. Now, moving into his presidency, the biggest crisis of his presidency that lasted pretty much through all 4 years was France. As we know, France through the 1790s was going through one upheaval after another through their revolution. And they generally were very angry at the United States because they expected us to support them in all of their various revolutionary fervor and wars that they had with the other countries, Great Britain in particular. And so what they would do along with Great Britain, because they're fighting Great Britain, they didn't like us trading with England, so they would attack our ships on the high seas. And so as soon as, yes?
Going back to Abigail and
So in the social atmosphere, she was much better than John Adams, let's put it this way. It was the job of the First Lady to be the social person, to throw the parties and have the dinners and all of that. John Adams went along with it, and I don't want to overstate that, because John Adams could be charming and engaging in dinner conversation as well, but she was really the one who softened the hearts, as it were, during the dinner parties.
Negotiating?
I wouldn't say that. I'll talk more about this with Jefferson, but the dinner parties were not about, generally speaking, they were not about politics. They were about relationships, softening the edges, as it were, so that you didn't see the other side as the enemy. You could be friends with someone with whom you disagreed, and that made working together better. So John Adams more than most, had a difficult time not talking about politics. Abigail was the one who could socialize more effectively. So anyway, so John Adams has this dilemma. You have the Federalists on one side, who generally just hate the French and lean more towards Great Britain. And then there's the Republicans, who lean more towards France and want to be conciliatory towards them. So, with his policy of preparing for war, but wanting to negotiate for peace, he angered both sides. And in an atmosphere like that, they generally looked for a way to be offended. And that's just the atmosphere of the day. So, during this time, when he sends his 3 envoys to France, it was customary and expected in Europe, and in France in particular, that if you want to negotiate, you pay a bribe. This was the famous XYZ affair. If anybody, how many of you know that term? The XYZ affair, okay. So 3 of these nameless contacts that they had, under the supervision of Talleyrand, who is the famous foreign emissary for France, dealing with foreign affairs, basically said, you need to grant a bribe to Talleyrand and a loan to France before we can talk. We are generally favorable to negotiations. We want to work this out, but this is the way it works. And so once that was sent back to the United States, that they expect a bribe and a loan, there was outrage. And now we want war with France. Now the people of the United States are so offended by this suggestion that we must give a bribe and a loan that now we want war. And so the Federalists are rising high, and the Republicans are in retreat because of that. Here's a little cartoon. Elbridge Gerry, Charles C. Pinckney, and John Marshall were the envoys from the United States. I don't know what they're saying in there. The words are so small, but it's ugly enough. That this ugly thing represents France. And this is the Americans. Of course, there's the guillotine over here. And so this just basically represents the ugliness of France. And so, with the Federalists riding high against the French influence, they pushed it, as they're wont to do, too far. The Alien and Sedition Acts we're going to get those Frenchmen, and we're going to get those who are criticizing our government also. So this is really just about suppressing the opposition. The Alien Act gave powers to the president to deport any foreigner that he felt needed to be deported, who was causing troubles. John Adams was not the type of guy who would indulge in that sort of thing, so he did not deport anybody. Although people among the Federalists were saying we should deport hundreds of them, thousands of them. There's just too many Frenchmen in this country who are causing problems, and others. The Sedition Act, on the other hand, was pursued because there were a lot of people who were really fed up with the ugliness in the press, the lies, the libel, and so this is one thing that John Adams actually supported. And it was said that even George Washington was saying, yeah, this is kind of long overdue, because they savaged me in the press when I was president, and so maybe it is time to rein in these newspaper men who are publishing these lies. And so there were a few who were arrested and fined through this. Of course, it was mainly the Republicans, the Republican press, that was being persecuted because the Federalists were now very strong in Congress. And so we needed to raise an army. And so we raised 10,000, and Washington was appointed by Adams to be the head of this new army to fight France, because most people believed that we were going to go to war with France. One stipulation that Washington had was that Hamilton was going to be second in charge. Adams hated Hamilton, and one of the things that Abigail would tell him too, that she absolutely hated Hamilton too. She thought he was just an evil man. But Washington insisted, and so Hamilton became second in charge. As it turned out, no war actually happened. They called it a quasi-war, or half-war, because it was mostly just on the high seas that France was attacking. Adams could have asked for a declaration of war, and Congress would have given it to him if he would have pushed for it, because so many people were angry. But he did not ask, and it did not happen. 1798, Adams had to give in to Washington, make Hamilton second in charge. Adams, one of the things, since Adams was the first president to take over for another president, he wasn't sure about the cabinet. The cabinet that Washington had in place was loyal to Hamilton. But he thought it would be improper for him to let go of the cabinet and nominate his own. That would seem to be an insult to Washington. So he kept Washington's cabinet, and it was basically directed by Alexander Hamilton. So he finally realized that. After 2 or 3 years, he knew that he needed to change up his cabinet, because they were not loyal to him. They worked against him in many ways. And also, Abigail became ill, and for several weeks was laid up in bed. And this was extremely troublesome for John Adams, because he needed her so much. But yeah, imagine being in bed for 11 weeks, being ill. That was Abigail during this time. Her health was never, in her elderly years, her health was never that great. And she had these bouts of severe illnesses on a number of occasions. Finally, at the end of the year, there was some good news that France was soundly defeated in the Battle of the Nile. Admiral Nelson in charge, and now the French are starting to be nice again. But now we come to the election of 1800. Many people were a bit disillusioned with the Federalists because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, that they had overstepped their boundaries, a little too angry towards the French, and now the tide is turning. Also, Hamilton had been working against Adams, decides that he's not going to support Adams. He's actually going to support the opposition. And Hamilton is one of the big names in the Federalist Party. So Adams had a lot going against him. So in the press, Jefferson is seen as a howling atheist. That had long been the charge against him, which was not true. He was certainly not a Christian in the fundamentalist sense that many believed at the time. He was a deist, believing in kind of an all-powerful being that looked down upon us. But he was well known for being against some of the fundamentalist beliefs of the day. Adams was seen as a monarchist, wanting to establish himself as king and his son as heir, and quite crazy for one thing or another that he had done. So anyway, the election of 1800 was a bit of a mess. Jefferson won, but it was actually a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And I'm not going to get into the complexities of that, but ultimately it was Hamilton who tipped the scales in favor of Jefferson as opposed to Burr. And so we have a new president, and this was the first time in our history we actually had an opposing party take over the presidency. And this was a great test for us, because in most countries, when you have opposition parties and one takes over for the other, as in France, how many times did that revolutionary government change hands? And every time the guillotine goes to work, getting rid of the opposition. That did not happen in the United States. People do not kill each other when the new party takes over. And this is a new thing in history. I emphasize again how fortunate we are to be in a country that did not persecute to the death the opposing party. Many countries still suffer from that, but it's not something we've ever done. So before John Adams quits the presidency and the Federalists realize that they are out, they had one last shot to impose their will on the United States, and that was the Judiciary Act of 1801. They expanded federal judges, adding 16 judgeships and appointing all good Federalists to it. And most importantly, John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who became the powerhouse in the judiciary for the next generation. And the thing that Thomas Jefferson would say for years afterwards, the one thing that he really resented about John Adams was this Judiciary Act, in which he crammed down at the last minute and signed into office so many Federalists in the judiciary. There's John Marshall. And then going on to Adams in retirement. He was very upset, of course, that he lost, but he ultimately took it with good grace. He was relieved to be done with it. And eventually, he connected with Jefferson again, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And here's this really neat statue, John and Abigail.
Is that in Braintree?
Yes, Braintree, thank you. In their hometown of Braintree, Massachusetts. Yeah. I think I'm pretty